My name's Daniel Carter, and if you told me 10 years ago that a neighborhood association could turn into the biggest headache of my life, I have laughed and brushed it off as suburban nonsense. But life has a strange way of teaching you lessons when you least expect it, and mine came wrapped up in the iron grip of a woman the entire community called Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. It all started when I decided to move out of the neighborhood that had drained every ounce of joy from me, only to find that Karen had other ideas. She believed she owned not only the streets and sidewalks, but the lives of the people who dared to live within her perfectly trimmed hedges and obsessively power-washed driveways. The kicker? She thought she had the authority to tell me whether I could move away or not. Imagine the audacity, believing you need permission to leave your own home. That's the kind of power Karen wielded in her own mind, and I became her latest target. For years, I had played along with the HOA rules. I kept my lawn neat, painted the shutters in the HOA-approved shades of beige, and even replaced my mailbox with the official model when Karen threatened me with a fine for having something too rustic. At first, I thought these rules were just minor annoyances, the kind of things you dealt with when you lived in a cookie-cutter community. But after a while, I realized it wasn't about maintaining order, it was about control. Karen loved rules the way a cat loves tormenting a mouse. She didn't enforce them to make the neighborhood better. She enforced them to feel powerful, to make everyone else small, and to remind us that we were subjects in her little kingdom. People whispered about her at block parties, shook their heads when she sent out her weekly email blasts filled with demands, but no one ever stood up to her. They were too afraid of the fines, the threats, the endless harassment. And honestly, so was I, for a time. The breaking point for me wasn't even the countless letters taped to my door or the aggressive notes slipped under my doormat. It wasn't the reminder emails that filled my inbox with bold red text about deadlines for repainting fences or trimming hedges. No, what finally pushed me over the edge was something deeply personal. My wife, Melissa, had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving me in a fog of grief I didn't know how to navigate. My house, the one we had bought together, suddenly fell hollow, echoing with memories that were too painful to sit with. I tried to hold on, tried to convince myself that staying there was a way to honor her, but over time, it became suffocating. The walls seemed to press in closer each day, and the silence after work was unbearable. I knew I needed a fresh start, someplace away from the constant reminders of what I had lost. That's when I decided to sell the house and move into a cabin I'd inherited from my uncle in the mountains, quiet, remote, and most importantly, far from the HOA's reach. But the moment word got out that I was planning to leave, Karen pounced. It was as if she had been waiting for the opportunity to dig her claws into me one last time before I escaped her reign. She showed up on my doorstep one afternoon, clipboard in hand, eyes blazing with that peculiar mix of self-righteousness and disdain she reserved for those she deemed unworthy of her community. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness, "you can't just move out without the HOA's approval. There are forms to file, inspections to pass, and of course, transfer fees to pay. We'll need to make sure the property is in compliance before you even think about leaving." I remember staring at her in disbelief, trying to decide if she was joking. She wasn't. Karen didn't joke. She dictated. I told her, calmly at first, that I didn't need her permission to sell my own home and move wherever I pleased. But Karen, unfazed, leaned closer as though I were a child who needed correcting. "The bylaws are very clear, Mr. Carter," she hissed. "Any homeowner who intends to vacate the property must notify the HOA board at least 6 months in advance, pay the community exit fee, and have the property inspected. You can't just pack up and disappear. That's not how things work here." Her tone made it sound as if she were talking about a prison sentence rather than a neighborhood. I wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it, but something in her eyes told me she wasn't bluffing. She truly believed she held the power to keep me trapped there. I brushed her off, of course. I told her I was moving whether she liked it or not, that I was done with the neighborhood and with her endless harassment. She stormed off, muttering about how I'd regret disrespecting her authority. But I didn't care. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of freedom. I started packing, boxing up the pieces of my life with a mix of sadness and relief. I could already picture the cabin in the mountains, the fresh pine air, the quiet mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch, the sound of birds instead of Karen's shrill voice. It was all within reach, or so I thought. The day of the move came, and as the movers loaded the last of my boxes onto the truck, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. Neighbors peeked from behind their curtains, some offering me quick waves, others just watching silently. I knew they wanted to leave too, but they were too afraid of what Karen would do. I couldn't blame them. I'd been in their shoes for years. Just as I was about to close the door of my car and follow the moving truck out of the neighborhood, flashing red and blue lights appeared in my rear-view mirror. My stomach dropped. The cops? At first, I thought there had been some accident nearby. But when two patrol cars pulled up directly in front of my driveway and blocked the moving truck from leaving, I knew this had Karen's fingerprints all over it. Sure enough, she appeared moments later, strutting across the street with her clipboard like some kind of deranged general leading troops into battle. She pointed at me, her voice loud enough for the whole block to hear. "That's him. That's the one. He's trying to leave without authorization." The officers exchanged glances, clearly confused, but Karen wasn't about to let logic interfere with her show. "He's violating HOA bylaws, and he refuses to comply with community standards. You need to arrest him immediately." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Arrest me? For moving out of my own house? This was insanity. The cops, to their credit, didn't put handcuffs on me right away. One of them, a tall guy with a mustache, approached and asked for my ID. I handed it over, trying to keep my composure. "Sir," he said, "we got a call from the HOA president here. She's claiming you're in violation of some kind of housing agreement. Can you explain what's going on?" I let out a dry laugh and explained the situation as calmly as I could. I owned the house. I had the legal right to sell it, and no neighborhood busybody could tell me otherwise. Karen, however, was relentless. She waved papers in the officer's face, shouting about bylaws and community obligations, trying to turn a simple move into a criminal offense. The absurdity of it all would have been comical if it wasn't so maddening. And that's when it hit me. I didn't have to fight this battle alone. I had someone on my side who could shut Karen down faster than any lawyer or cop. My son, Michael. To the neighbors, he was just a polite young man who came by to visit his dad from time to time. What they didn't know, and what Karen was about to find out the hard way, was that Michael wasn't just anyone. He was an FBI agent, trained to deal with people far more dangerous and manipulative than a suburban tyrant with a clipboard. And as luck would have it, Michael had driven down that morning to help me with the move. He was already inside the house, carrying out one last box when the cop arrived. I remember the moment he stepped out the front door, calm and collected, with that unmistakable presence that commanded attention. Karen had no idea what she had just walked into. Michael stepped out of the house like he had all the time in the world, balancing a heavy box in one hand and wearing that same calm expression that had carried him through interrogations, high-stakes investigations, and undercover operations. To me, he was my son, the kid I'd raised, the boy who used to chase fireflies in the backyard, the teenager who fixed up my old Chevy with his bare hands. But to the world, and now to Karen, he was a force to be reckoned with. He set the box down gently on the porch, brushed the dust off his jeans, and scanned the scene. The squad cars blocking the driveway, the officers looking half bemused, half annoyed, and Karen standing there like she was a star witness in a trial that only existed in her mind. His eyes narrowed ever so slightly, and I knew then that Karen's reign of terror was about to crumble. "Is there a problem here?" Michael asked, his voice steady but carrying an edge of authority that immediately shifted the atmosphere. The cops turned to him, instinctively recognizing that he wasn't just some random bystander. Even Karen, for the first time since I'd known her, seemed to hesitate. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air before she regained her composure. "Yes, officer," she started, mistaking Michael for a policeman. "This man, this homeowner, is trying to leave our community without the HOA's permission. He's in clear violation of bylaws, and I demand you take action." She jabbed a manicured finger in my direction, her face flushed with the kind of fury that came from someone used to always getting her way. Michael didn't so much as flinch. He reached into his back pocket, pulled out his badge, and flipped it open with the kind of smooth motion that made the two patrol officers straighten up immediately. "Special Agent Michael Carter, FBI," he said, his tone professional but with a hint of warning. Karen blinked rapidly, her words stuttering to a halt. You could almost see the gears turning in her head as she realized she just accused a federal agent's father of breaking HOA bylaws. The absurdity of her crusade was finally laid bare. The officers exchanged glances, and one of them let out a quiet sigh, like he'd just been handed an out from what was clearly shaping up to be the dumbest call of his career. Karen tried to recover, puffing herself up and waving her clipboard like it was a sword. I don't care who you are. This community has rules, and no one is above them. Not even you, Agent Carter. Your father can't just pack up and leave without following the proper procedures. There are fees, inspections, and Michael raised a hand, cutting her off mid-rant. "Ma'am," he said evenly, I deal with people who run international fraud schemes and violent criminal organizations. Do you really think the federal government cares about whether or not my dad mows his lawn to your standards?" The sheer flatness in his voice silenced her. The neighbors, who had been peeking out from behind curtains and hedges, suddenly seemed emboldened. A few even stepped outside, watching with barely concealed smirks as the HOA queen was put in her place. The officers, now clearly fed up with the circus, pulled Karen aside. I couldn't hear everything they said, but their body language told the story. Arms crossed, head shaking, the kind of exasperated gestures cops make when they've been dragged into something ridiculous. Karen's face turned redder by the second, her mouth working overtime to convince them she was right. But eventually, the taller officer turned back to me and said, "Mr. Carter, you're free to go. We don't enforce HOA rules. This was a civil matter, not a criminal one." He handed me back my ID and gave me a look that said, "Sorry you have to deal with this lunatic." Michael stood nearby, arms folded, watching everything with a hawk's eye. But if I thought Karen was going to give up that easily, I underestimated the depths of her delusion. As soon as the cops released me, she came storming back, her voice shrill enough to wake the dead. "This isn't over. You think you can just walk away? The HOA has lawyers, and we'll sue you for breach of contract. We'll put a lien on your property, freeze the sale, drag you through court until you wish you'd never defied me." She was shaking now, so consumed by her own need for dominance that she didn't notice the neighbors quietly recording her meltdown on their phones. Michael noticed, though, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward in the faintest smile. "Ma'am," he said, stepping closer to her, "you might want to think very carefully about the threats you make in front of witnesses and law enforcement officers. Harassment, intimidation, filing false police reports. These are serious offenses. And if you continue, you won't just be dealing with a homeowners association lawsuit. You'll be dealing with the federal government." His voice dropped low on those last words, the kind of tone that carried weight because it was backed by power. Karen froze. For the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, like she was finally beginning to grasp that her clipboard and bylaws didn't mean a damn thing outside the bubble of her little empire. The officers climbed back into their cars and drove off, leaving Karen standing there trembling with rage and humiliation. Michael clapped me on the shoulder, his expression softening. "Come on, Dad. Let's get you out of here." It should have ended there. A clean break, a fresh start in the mountains where Karen's shadow couldn't reach. But people like her don't just let go. Control is their oxygen, and when you take it away, they become dangerous. Over the next few days, as the moving truck made its way toward my new home and I followed behind, I kept getting phone calls from unknown numbers. At first, I ignored them, but when the voicemail started filling up my inbox with threats and demands, I knew Karen wasn't done. She claimed I owed thousands in exit fees, that the HOA had voted to place fines on my property, that she contacted attorneys who would ensure I never saw a penny from the sale. Michael told me not to worry. He said he'd seen this kind of behavior before. People who built little empires in their minds and thought the world revolved around their rules. But even as he reassured me, I could see the flicker of protectiveness in his eyes. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone else, mess with me. And in the weeks that followed, as I settled into my cabin and started the slow process of rebuilding my life, Michael began quietly gathering information, not just about Karen, but about the HOA itself. What he found was more explosive than anything I could have imagined. Turns out, Karen's obsession with control wasn't just about lawns and fences. The HOA had been running a scheme for years, illegally inflating fees, pocketing money that was supposed to go toward neighborhood maintenance, and using threats of fines and liens to squeeze homeowners into submission. Karen wasn't just a busybody with too much time on her hands. She was at the center of a fraudulent operation that had been bleeding the community dry under the guise of community improvement. Michael laid it all out for me one evening at the cabin, his laptop open on the table, files and spreadsheets glowing on the screen. "Dad," he said, "this isn't just harassment anymore. This is federal. Wire fraud, embezzlement, mail fraud. She's been falsifying documents and sending them through the Postal Service. That's a crime I can put her away for." I sat there in stunned silence, the pieces finally clicking into place. No wonder Karen fought so hard to keep control. No wonder she reacted so violently to the idea of me leaving without her approval. She wasn't just trying to enforce rules. She was trying to protect the scam she'd built, the one that funded her lifestyle and kept the neighborhood under her thumb. Every note taped to my door, every threat, every bogus fine, it was all part of a bigger picture. And now, Thanks to my son, the truth was coming to light. Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on mine. You've been through enough, Dad. She took advantage of you, of everyone in that neighborhood. It's time someone stopped her, and I'm going to make sure she never does this to anyone else again. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just a promise. For the first time since Melissa's death, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope, not just for myself, but for every family still stuck in that neighborhood, living under Karen's reign of fear. The thing about starting over is that you expect peace to come easily. You imagine that once you close the door on the past, once you physically leave the place that hurt you, you'll breathe easier. And in some ways, that was true. The cabin was everything I had hoped it would be. Perched on the edge of a quiet ridge, surrounded by towering pines, it felt like the world had been stripped down to its essentials. Wind through the branches, the call of an owl at night, the smell of wood smoke curling from the fireplace. For the first time in years, I could sit on the porch without feeling like I was being watched, judged, or measured against some impossible standard set by Karen's clipboard. But peace is fragile, and it only lasts as long as the ghosts of your past stay buried. And Karen, well, she was no ghost. She was a storm that refused to pass. The phone calls continued. Sometimes it was her voice, shrill and commanding, demanding money or threatening lawsuits. Other times it was silence, just heavy breathing before the line went dead. Once, I even received a letter and signed but unmistakably written in her neat, controlling script, telling me that if I didn't return to the community to resolve my obligations, I would face severe consequences. I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the paper curl into ash, but the feeling of unease lingered. Karen wasn't just angry that I'd left. She was terrified of what my leaving might uncover. And she had every reason to be, because Michael wasn't just my son anymore. He was a shadow she couldn't escape. Michael worked quietly, methodically, the way he always did. He started by talking to some of the neighbors, using his badge when necessary, but more often just relying on his charm and patience. He discovered that most of them had been bullied into silence, afraid that if they spoke up, Karen would target them next. She had fined people for everything from leaving the garbage can out an hour too long to planting the wrong color flowers in their gardens. And when fines weren't enough, she escalated. She threatened liens, foreclosure, even legal action. The officers climbed back into their cars and drove off, leaving Karen standing there trembling with rage and humiliation. Michael clapped me on the shoulder, his expression softening. Come on, Dad. Let's get you out of here. It should have ended there. A clean break, a fresh start in the mountains where Karen's shadow couldn't reach. But people like her don't just let go. Control is their oxygen, and when you take it away, they become dangerous. Over the next few days, as the moving truck made its way toward my new home and I followed behind, I kept getting phone calls from unknown numbers. At first, I ignored them, but when the voicemail started filling up my inbox with threats and demands, I knew Karen wasn't done. She claimed I owed thousands in exit fees, that the HOA had voted to place fines on my property, that she contacted attorneys who ensure I never saw a penny from the sale. Michael told me not to worry. He said he'd seen this kind of behavior before. People who built little empires in their minds and thought the world revolved around their rules. But even as he reassured me, I could see the flicker of protectiveness in his eyes. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone else, mess with me. And in the weeks that followed, as I settled into my cabin and started the slow process of rebuilding my life, Michael began quietly gathering information, not just about Karen, but about the HOA itself. What he found was more explosive than anything I could have imagined. Turns out, Karen's obsession with control wasn't just about lawns and fences. The HOA had been running a scheme for years, illegally inflating fees, pocketing money that was supposed to go toward neighborhood maintenance, and using threats of fines and liens to squeeze homeowners into submission. Karen wasn't just a busybody with too much time on her hands. She was at the center of a fraudulent operation that had been bleeding the community dry under guise of community improvement. Michael laid it all out for me one evening at the cabin, his laptop open on the table, files and spreadsheets glowing on the screen. Dad, he said, this isn't just harassment anymore. This is federal. Wire fraud, embezzlement, mail fraud. She's been falsifying documents and sending them through the Postal Service. That's a crime I can put her away for. I sat there in stunned silence, the pieces finally clicking into place. No wonder Karen fought so hard to keep control. No wonder she reacted so violently to the idea of me leaving without her approval. She wasn't just trying to enforce rules. She was trying to protect the scam she'd built, the one that funded her lifestyle and kept the neighborhood under her thumb. Every note taped to my door, every threat, every bogus fine. It was all part of a bigger picture. And now, thanks to my son, the truth was coming to light. Michael leaned back in his chair, his eyes steady on mine. You've been through enough, Dad. She took advantage of you, of everyone in that neighborhood. It's time someone stopped her, and I'm going to make sure she never does this to anyone else again. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just a promise. For the first time since Melissa's death, I felt something I hadn't in years. Hope, not just for myself, but for every family still stuck in that neighborhood, living under Karen's reign of fear. Paragraph 3. The thing about starting over is that you expect peace to come easily. You imagine that once you close the door on the past, once you physically leave the place that hurt you, you'll breathe easier. And in some ways, that was true. The cabin was everything I had hoped it would be. Perched on the edge of a quiet ridge, surrounded by towering pines, it felt like the world had been stripped down to its essentials. Wind through the branches, the call of an owl at night, the smell of wood smoke curling from the fireplace. For the first time in years, I could sit on the porch without feeling like I was being watched, judged, or measured against some impossible standard set by Karen's clipboard. But peace is fragile, and it only lasts as long as the ghosts of your past stay buried. And Karen, well, she was no ghost. She was a storm that refused to pass. The phone calls continued. Sometimes it was her voice, shrill and commanding, demanding money or threatening lawsuits. Other times it was silence, just heavy breathing before the line went dead. Once, I even received a letter and signed but unmistakably written in her neat, controlling script, telling me that if I didn't return to the community to resolve my obligations, I would face severe consequences. I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the paper curl into ash, but the feeling of unease lingered. Karen wasn't just angry that I'd left. She was terrified of what my leaving might uncover, and she had every reason to be, because Michael wasn't just my son anymore. He was a shadow she couldn't escape. Michael worked quietly, methodically, the way he always did. He started by talking to some of the neighbors, using his badge when necessary, but more often just relying on his charm and patience. He discovered that most of them had been bullied into silence, afraid that if they spoke up, Karen would target them next. She had fined people for everything from leaving a garbage can out an hour too long to planting the wrong color flowers in their gardens. And when fines weren't enough, she escalated. She threatened liens, foreclosure, even legal action. For a few weeks after Karen's arrest, life finally started to feel normal, or at least as close to normal as I could remember. The phone stopped ringing. The mailbox no longer held letter stuffed with threats. The nights were quiet, filled only with the soft hum of crickets and the rustling of wind through the trees. For the first time in a long time, I slept soundly, no longer jolted awake by nightmares of Karen's shrill voice or the flashing red and blue lights of patrol cars in my driveway. Michael, though, reminded me not to get too comfortable. Dad, he said, leaning back in his chair one evening, when you cut the head off a snake, sometimes the body still thrashes around. Don't think this is over just because she's behind bars. I didn't want to believe him, but he was right. Karen might have been the face of the HOA's corruption, but she hadn't acted alone. Her little kingdom had been propped up by a board of hand-picked cronies, people who either shared in the profits or were too scared to question her. And when the feds raided her house, they didn't just find financial records. They found names, dozens of them. Contractors who'd been paid off to inflate invoices, board members who signed off on bogus expenses, even lawyers who had looked the other way while Karen twisted the bylaws to her advantage. It was a web, and she was only the center. The strands reached farther than anyone had realized. Michael and his colleagues spent months untangling it, and I watched in the sidelines as the case grew bigger than either of us had expected. What had started as one woman's vendetta against me had turned into a full-blown investigation into systemic fraud that touched every corner of the community. More arrests followed, quiet, methodical takedowns that never made the evening news but sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. One board member fled the state, only to be tracked down in Arizona. Another tried to cut a deal, spilling details about offshore accounts Karen had set up in her sister's name. Piece by piece, the empire crumbled. But empires don't fall quietly. The deeper Michael dug, the more resistance he faced. Anonymous threats started arriving, not to me this time, but to him. Slips of paper under his windshield wipers. Emails from encrypted accounts warning him to drop the case or else. He brushed them off, said it was all part of the job, but I could see the weariness in his eyes. I hated that my mess had pulled him into danger, hated that his career was now entangled with my old neighborhood nightmare. But every time I suggested he step back, he shook his head. Dad, this isn't just about you anymore. It's bigger than both of us. And I'm not stopping until every last piece of the scam is exposed. I tried to distract myself with cabin life, chopping wood, fishing in the nearby stream, fixing up the place little by little. It helped to a point. But every time I looked out at the tree line, I half expected to see another car parked there, another pair of eyes watching me. Michael had been right all along. The body of the snake was still thrashing. And as much as I wanted peace, I knew it wouldn't truly come until the whole thing was over. One night, just as autumn was beginning to paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Michael came home later than usual. He looked exhausted, his suit jacket slung over one arm, his tie loosened. I poured him a glass of whiskey, and he sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "Big day?" I asked. He gave a tired laugh. "You could say that. We flipped one of the contractors today. He gave us everything, bank accounts, emails, the works. Karen wasn't just running a little HOA scam. Dad, she was laundering money. Millions of dollars, funneled through fake maintenance projects. It's not just fraud anymore, it's organized crime." I stared at him, the words settling over me like a heavy blanket. Organized crime. Those were the kinds of words you read in the newspaper, not something you expect to be tied to a quiet suburban neighborhood with white picket fences and neatly trimmed lawns. But the more Michael explained, the more it made sense. The constant pressure for fees, the inflated dues, the way Karen acted like a dictator. It wasn't just about control. It was about money, power, greed. And now that greed had pulled in players far more dangerous than a nosy HOA president with clipboard. That realization hit home a week later, when someone broke into the cabin. I came back from a morning hike to find the front door ajar, the lock smashed. My heart pounded as I stepped inside, half expecting to see the place ransacked. But nothing was missing. The furniture was untouched. The kitchen was still neat. The only thing out of place was a single sheet of paper on the kitchen table. Written in thick black marker were the words, "Stay out of it. Last warning." I called Michael immediately. He arrived within the hour, his expression grim as he read the note. "This isn't Karen," he said flatly. "This is bigger. She's in custody. Someone else is trying to scare you." He took the note as evidence, dusted for prints, made a few calls. But I could tell he was rattled, even if he wouldn't admit it. For the first time, the danger wasn't abstract. It wasn't just angry voicemails or idle threats. It was here in my home, invading the one place I thought was safe. Michael insisted on installing extra security, cameras, motion sensors, reinforced locks. He even started spending more nights at the cabin, as if to put a wall between me and whatever danger was creeping closer. I tried to argue, told him I didn't want to disrupt his life, but he just shook his head. "Dad, you spent years protecting me when I was a kid. Let me do this for you now." There was no arguing with that. Still, the pressure weighed on me. I found myself jumpy at every sound, every crunch of leaves outside the window. And yet, beneath the fear, there was something else, a fire I hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was just the stubborn Carter streak Melissa always said ran too deep in me. Whatever it was, I realized I was done being afraid. Karen had tried to control me. The HOA had tried to break me. And now, whoever was pulling the strings thought they could intimidate me into silence. But I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Michael saw it too. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the mountains, he turned to me with a rare smile. "You know, Dad, you've got more fight in you than half the agents I work with." I chuckled, shaking my head. "I'm just an old man trying to live in peace." He raised his glass. "An old man who stood up to a corrupt system and helped bring down a criminal empire. Don't sell yourself short." The investigation pressed on, bigger now than ever. Federal indictments rolled out, charges stacked high, and the HOA that once ruled my life became the centerpiece of one of the largest suburban fraud cases in the state's history. My name came up in the reports, not as a victim, not as a pawn, but as a man whose stubborn refusal to bow to Karen's demands had sparked it all. And though I never sought recognition, I couldn't deny the strange sense of vindication that came with it. Yet even as the case built momentum, I knew the fight wasn't over. Too many people still had stakes in the game. Too many loose ends dangled. Karen might have been in custody, but her allies weren't gone. And as much as I wanted to believe the nightmare was behind me, Deep down, I knew Michael was right. The snake still had life left in it, and sooner or later, it was going to strike again. The first real snow of winter had just dusted the mountains when I realized how much the world had changed since the day Karen first came pounding on my door. The cabin, once my escape from chaos, had turned into the headquarters of federal investigation. Michael's colleagues came and went, sometimes staying late into the night with laptops glowing, papers spread across the table, voices hushed but urgent. The case had grown beyond Karen's HOA tyranny. What they were uncovering now was a skeleton of an entire criminal network. Karen herself was still in jail, but she wasn't quiet. Word reached us through Michael that she was bargaining, dangling secrets in front of prosecutors like a cat playing with a mouse. She thought she could cut a deal, thought she could reduce her sentence by giving up her partners. But the thing about snakes is, they'll bite even when they're cornered. And Karen was venomous to the last drop. I should have been relieved that justice was catching up with her. But the truth was, I lived every day with a shadow of her influence still hanging over me. It wasn't paranoia, it was reality. The break-in at my cabin had proved it. Someone else out there was still pulling strings, and I had no idea how far they would go to silence me. Michael kept telling me not to worry. He'd smile, crack jokes, even cook me breakfast some mornings like he used to when he was a teenager. But beneath that calm exterior, I could see the strain. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from higher-ups, meetings stacked one after another. This wasn't just another case for him anymore. It was personal, and I hated that. I hated that my stubborn feud with a corrupt HOA president had dragged my son into a war with criminals who had nothing to lose. Then came a night that confirmed my worst fears. It was late, close to midnight. I was dozing in my chair by the fireplace when I heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel. Not Michael's car. He always texted before pulling up the drive. My pulse quickened. I killed the lamp and crept to the window. Headlights swept across the trees, then cut out. A car door opened. Closed. Silence. I grabbed the old shotgun I kept by the door. My hands shook, not from age, but from the raw, electric fear surging through me. I'd fought wars in boardrooms and stood my ground against Karen's schemes, but this was different. This was primal. Someone was out there in the dark, and they weren't here to talk about overdue HOA dues. The knock came, sharp and deliberate. 3 raps. Mr. Carter. A voice called. Mail. Cold. Measured. We just want to chat. Every instinct screamed at me to stay quiet, but my pride, my damn Carter pride, flared up. I cracked the door, shotgun visible. Chat somewhere else. I growled. The man stepped into the faint moonlight. He was tall, dressed in black, a beanie pulled low over his forehead. Behind him, another figure leaned against the car, arms crossed. They weren't neighbors. They weren't police. They were the kind of men you didn't meet by accident. You're making things harder than they need to be. The man said evenly, Karen's situation, it doesn't have to drag you down too. You could just stop. Stop talking. Stop helping. Let things fade. And if I don't, I asked. His smile was thin, humorless. Accidents happen. Cabins burn. Old men slip on ice. You'd be amazed how quickly people forget. I raised the shotgun higher. Get off my land. For a moment, time froze. Then the man chuckled, stepped back, and lifted his hands. Fair enough. But think it over, Mr. Carter. You're not as untouchable as you think. He turned, walked back to the car, and within seconds the vehicle was gone, swallowed by the night. I locked the door, bolted it, then sank against the wall, my chest heaving. I just stared down men who carried the kind of weight Karen could only dream of. And I knew with bone-deep certainty that this wasn't about an HOA anymore. This was about the money, the laundering, the empire Karen had helped build. And they weren't going to let me or Michael tear it down without a fight. When Michael arrived the next morning, and I told her what happened, his face hardened. He called in immediately, and soon my quiet mountain cabin was crawling with federal agents, surveillance teams, plainclothes security. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But the danger was real, too real. The weeks that followed were a blur of tension. Every knock at the door made me flinch. Every time Michael left, I worried he wouldn't come back. Yet through it all, I refused to run. I'd spent too many years letting Karen push me around. If I gave up now, if I let these shadowy figures scare me into silence, then everything I'd endure would be for nothing. And then, just when I thought things couldn't escalate further, Karen made her move. From behind bars, she managed to orchestrate a leak emails, documents, all pointing fingers at her former allies. But she didn't just expose them. She dragged Michael's name into the mess, claiming he had fabricated evidence to frame her. It was a desperate, venomous lie. But in the court of public opinion, lies travel faster than truth. Reporters swarmed. Headlines screamed. My son's career, the career he had built with integrity and grit, was suddenly hanging by a thread. I had never felt more powerless. Watching Michael stand tall at press conferences, defending his work with calm professionalism, while knowing the toll it was taking on him, it broke something in me. This was no longer about my fight with Karen. This was about saving my son. So I did the only thing I could. I went public. For years, I had kept quiet, lived in the shadows of this mess. But now, I stepped into the light. I gave interviews. I told my story, every detail, every threat, every crooked maneuver Karen had pulled. I laid out the harassment, the break-ins, the intimidation, and I told the world what kind of man my son really was. Not a fraud, not a manipulator, but a fighter for justice, a man who had sacrificed his peace to stand up against corruption. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors came forward, voices that had been silent for too long. People who had been bullied by Karen. People who had paid bribes just to keep their homes. People who had been too scared to speak. Until now. The floodgates opened, and suddenly Karen's web of lies collapsed under the weight of truth. The trial that followed was brutal. Karen, defiant to the end, sneered from the witness stand, spinning stories and pointing fingers. But the evidence was undeniable. Every document, every bank record, every witness stacked against her. And when the verdict was finally read, guilty on all counts, I felt a weight lift off my chest that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying for years. Karen was sentenced to decades in federal prison. Her allies scattered, their empire dismantled piece by piece. The men who had threatened me disappeared into the justice system, their power stripped away. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, silence returned to my world. Not the uneasy silence of fear, but the peace I had longed for. Michael's name was cleared. His reputation, if anything, was stronger than ever. He'd been tested in fire, and he'd come out tempered steel. And me? I was just an old man in a cabin, sitting on a porch as the snow fell softly, knowing that I had survived. Sometimes I think back to that first day, the knock on the door, Karen standing there with her smug smile and her clipboard full of rules. If I had caved then, if I had just paid her fees and fallen in line, maybe none of this would have happened. Maybe my life would have been quiet, simple, easy. But then I look at Michael, at the man he's become, and I realize it was worth it, all of it. Because sometimes peace isn't given. Sometimes peace is fought for, tooth and nail, against people who would take it from you. And when you finally earn it, when you finally sit in the silence and know you've beaten the darkness, it means more than anything else in the world. The HOA was gone. Karen was gone. The threats were gone. And in their place, there was only peace.